Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Megan Sniffen-Marinoff, and I am University Archivist at Harvard, and also one of the many people who have worked over the years on the Colonial North America at Harvard Library Project, or CNA, as we call it. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the second in a series of events over the coming weeks that will reveal some of the content in and work related to the project. Let me say a few words at the outset about CNA. Our project began roughly 10 years ago. We knew that the Harvard Library had rich but still untapped or not easy to access manuscript and archival resources from the 17th and 18th centuries related to what is loosely referred to as colonial North America. We thought if we could find a way through digitization to make not just highly curated selections, but all of these materials more accessible to people, both inside Harvard and across the world, that we could contribute to the expanding and changing understanding of our collective past. A decade of work, surveying the collections, locating and identifying materials in 15 of Harvard's libraries and archives, improving description and metadata, conserving materials enough to be handled for digitization, making images of these items, adding links to catalog records and other guides, and developing a website to make them even more approachable and accessible has now largely concluded. The CNA collection consists of approximately 700,000 digitized pages. Each item is connected to countless stories of lives lived quietly and extravagantly, of encounters peaceful and volatile, and of places near and far, providing an opportunity to rethink familiar stories and to discover new ones. The materials provide insights through the eyes of people who not only wrote about revolution and politics or war and diplomacy, but also about topics such as education, trade, finance, law, science, medicine, religion, family affairs, social life, food supplies, and even agriculture. The collections also represent, both directly and indirectly, lives not easily identified in cataloging efforts from generations past, including those of women and indigenous and enslaved peoples. Many of the documents contain visual materials, such as drawings, sketches, maps, and other illustrations. In addition to reflecting the origins of the United States, the digitized materials also document aspects of life and work in geographical areas such as Great Britain, France, the Mediterranean coast, Canada, the Caribbean, and Mexico. Colonial North America is a term used very loosely for this collection, with manuscripts and archival collections naturally and inherently in crossing the boundaries of identified timeframes. Before turning the program over to our speakers, I'd like to thank Grace Strong, Hannah Hack, and Monica Key for all their assistance in preparing this event. And to Martha Whitehead and Francisca Frey, we thank you for all your support. So today we've arranged a panel of representatives from several of the libraries and archives that contributed to the digitization project. Each one has selected one of her or his favorite items from the CNA collection to describe with a bit of depth. The speakers are, in the order that they will present, John Overholt, curator of the Donald and Mary Hyde collection of Dr. Samuel Johnson and early books and manuscripts at Houghton Library; Karen Beck, manager of historical and special collections at Harvard Law School Library; Scott Podolsky, professor of global health and social medicine, affiliate of the Department of the History of Science, and director of the Center for the History of Medicine at Harvard Medical School; Jessica Suarez, curator of archives and manuscripts at Harvard Divinity School; Timothy Mahoney, special collections librarian of manuscripts at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School; and Ross Mulcair, archivist for outreach, research, instruction, and special projects at the Harvard University Archives. We've left time at the end for them to address questions that you can pose to them throughout. We wanted just to point out that Scott Podolsky needs to leave promptly at 4 p.m. So please register early any questions you might have for him specifically. So I'm going to turn this over to John to get us started.
Thank you, Megan. So these talks were advertised as a chance for curators to highlight favorite objects from the CNA project. And that's perhaps not the right way to describe this piece, but I do think it's important and valuable, and I'm glad to have the chance to share it with you today. I acquired this manuscript for Houghton in 2017, thanks to the Donald and Mary Hyde Endowment. Can we have the next slide, please? This is a list of the people enslaved by a wealthy Englishman named Slingsby Bethel on his sugar plantation in Antigua in 1753. Though he spent some of his early adulthood in Antigua, by the time of this inventory, he was wealthy enough to return to England and have other people manage his holdings. 2 years later, he'd be appointed Lord Mayor of London, and he served in Parliament for more than a decade. The facts of his life are pretty well documented, but of course that's not true for the people he enslaved. Take the next slide. In a system designed to erase every trace of their humanity, this is one of the few surviving records of it. They have only the first names imposed upon them, their ages, and the work they performed. Any comments about them relate to their value as property. After itemizing the 182 people on the estate, the document devotes a further 3 pages to describing the equipment used to process the sugar cane grown on the plantation into molasses and rum, the guns and bayonets in the plantation's armory, and its herd of cattle. Next slide, please. Something I'm always on the lookout for as a curator is an artifact that collapses historical distance, something that makes the past seem less abstract and more immediate. If anyone needs the historical reality of slavery illuminated for them, and it often seems that modern day white people do, then this document can certainly do that. But I also think it has a more important kind of evidentiary value. Next slide, please. Some of you may have seen the recent Harvard Gazette article about a major new database tracking people involved in or victimized by the slave trade. Documents like this are the raw material that fuels those efforts. In the book Dispossessed Lives, which I want to thank my colleague Sarah Powell for directing me to, Professor Marissa Fuentes writes, quote, "The very nature of slavery in the 18th century Caribbean made enslaved life fleeting and rendered access to literacy nearly impossible. Yet the women who appear in the archival fragments on which this book draws offer a crucial glimpse into lives lived under the domination of slavery. Lives that were just as important as those of more visible and literate people in this period, who most consistently left an abundance of documentary material." Unquote. By acquiring this manuscript and making it freely available digitally, we've made a contribution to the work of recovering those lives and giving them a place in the historical record. I think that's emblematic of the importance of the CNA project as a whole, and something that you'll see reflected in the items that my colleagues are presenting today. And with that, I'll thank you and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, John. And now we will move on to Karen Beck.
Thank you. And can I have the first slide, please? This item from the Harvard Law School Library's Historical and Special Collections is a copy of testimony taken at the 1656 Slander Trial of Sarah Bridgman in Springfield, Massachusetts. In this trial, Joseph Parsons sued Sarah Bridgman for accusing his wife, Mary Bliss Parsons, of being a witch. This document is a good example of 2 issues that 17th century Puritans were concerned with: witchcraft and the power of language. It's also a great example of how law was practiced at the local level in colonial North America. Before going any further, I'd like to thank my colleagues Leslie Schoenfeld and Christopher Spraker for their help with this presentation. This testimony, as you can see, it's a 2-page document about 14 inches high by 8 inches wide, with densely written text on 3 of its 4 sides. The Harvard Law School Library acquired it from Boston's Goodspeed's Bookshop in 1941. And it's related to another item in our collection, also acquired from Goodspeed's in 1927, and also part of the CNA collection. Can I have the next slide? The related item is a small volume, about 6 by 8 inches and 300 pages, recording the legal cases that came before William Pynchon, the magistrate of Agawam in what is now Springfield, Massachusetts. William Pynchon, his son John, and his son-in-law Eliezer Holyoke recorded local law cases that came before them between 1638 and 1702. This volume is significant because most colonial historical legal works focused on the higher courts, while this one shows legal life at the grassroots level. Our slander case, Parsons versus Bridgman, was tried before John Pynchon and Eliezer Holyoke. Although the Parsons and Bridgman families figured prominently in Pynchon's notebook, both as frequent litigants and also as active pillars of the community, there's no mention of Sarah Bridgman's slander trial in the notebook. And can I have the next slide, please? So here's an excerpt from page 3 of the testimony in the slander trial as recorded by Eliezer Holyoke on August 11, 1656. It shows James Bridgman's testimony on behalf of his wife. James was one of 6 townspeople, including Sarah Bridgman herself, who testified about troubling and unexplained events that befell them after they had argued with Mary Parsons. Formerly healthy livestock died. People, including Sarah and James Bridgman's son, succumbed to freak accidents and illnesses, and some, also including the Bridgman's son, claimed to see visions of Mary Parsons accompanied by a witch's familiar in the form of a black mouse. Well, as the case unfolded, some people who initially testified on Sarah's behalf changed their stories. And remember, this trial was not about Mary Parsons being guilty of witchcraft, but about Sarah Bridgman being liable for slandering Mary. So hearing of the recanting of some testimony and finding other stories not credibly attributable to witchcraft, the magistrates found Sarah liable for slander. She was ordered either to pay a fine or to make a public apology in both Northampton and Springfield, and she chose to pay the fine. Nearly 20 years later, in 1675, testimony from this slander trial would be used as evidence when Mary Bliss Parsons was tried for witchcraft in Boston. Mary was acquitted, but she remained under a cloud of suspicion in her hometown. So this testimony, especially taken together with William Pynchon's legal notebook, is useful evidence for studying legal, cultural, religious, women's, and local history. It gives insight into the power of words and whose words we listen to, and gives a glimpse of everyday life as seen through the lens of the law. The Pynchon notebook has been the subject of a book-length study of local colonial lawmaking and is featured in English legal history courses at the Harvard and Boston College Law Schools. And the story of Sarah Bridgman's slander trial is one of historic Northampton's history and home offerings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And now we will move on to Scott Podolsky.
Great, so we chose from the Countway a series of letters exchanged in 1652 and 1653 between Richard Odell and John Winthrop Jr., when Winthrop, the son of the founding governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was still the future governor of Connecticut, and at the time, the leading colonial medical practitioner in New England. These are among the more than 24 letters we have that were sent to Winthrop for medical advice. In these particular letters, Odell asks for help regarding his 5-year-old daughter, offer a window onto contemporary medical thinking, the nature of communication in 17th century New England, and the very relationships among theology, medicine, science, and politics on the eve of the scientific revolution. Winthrop, like nearly all physicians in the colonies, had never attended medical school. But while most medical care was still delivered in the home, it appears that his reputation as a political leader and his reputation as a healer were mutually reinforcing. Moreover, he treated numerous Native Americans, helping to increase his authority and respect among selected Native American populations during a tumultuous and shifting period of time for colonial Native American relations, including those concerning Winthrop, which is well covered in William Woodward's excellent book, Prosperous America. It's against this backdrop that we see the following exchange, and we could do the first slide, within 3 letters concerning Richard Odell's daughter, Lydia. Odell first wrote to Winthrop in November of 1652, stating, quote, "Sir, I have made bold to trouble you with a few lines. It has pleased the Almighty to lay his afflicting hand upon a child of mine by a disease which I think to be the palsy. She has been afflicted with an icky humor all over her body, especially in her head, ever since she was 1 year old. Last month, she was sitting by the fire and rose up hastily to fetch some food and fell down upon one side. After that, she was neither able to speak nor stand, having lost the use of the right side from head to the foot. My humble request is that you would speedily send me some directions what to do, and some such materials as may be had and are useful in such a case. If no other means be present, please do me the favor to send an Indian over, and I shall satisfy him for his pains," unquote. We see in the first lines, quoted as "please the Almighty," the legacy of the medical providentialism of Puritan New England, though one far from incompatible with the belief that intellectual endeavor could uncover the means of healing patients. Moreover, it's a complicated world of separated communities. Catherine Grandjean, in American Passage, discusses the evolving means of communication among such communities, with Native Americans often playing important roles in these networks, reflected in Odell's final comment regarding, quote, "sending an Indian over." Next slide, please. In his reply to Odell, Winthrop noted, quote, "You desire directions concerning your child, which is very uncertain to do in the absence of the party, it being difficult to find out the true cause and seat of such disease, except by the most diligent and curious observation where the patient is daily present," unquote. But still he tried. And therapeutically, we find Winthrop as the primary practitioner of alchemical medicine in the New World. Alchemy has a historically distorted reputation, often considered as a Harry Potter-esque attempt to find the Philosopher's Stone. It was a vibrant and optimistic effort to uncover God's secrets through chemical investigation. Medical alchemists prescribed more mineral-derived remedies than did their herbal prescribing counterparts. But again, things were complicated, and we see evidence of Winthrop's ecumenical medicine in the diverse mineral-derived and botanical remedies he offered for Odell's daughter. Perhaps most fundamentally, we see a therapeutic imperative to do something despite Winthrop's distance from his patient, as well as a shared system of belief between Winthrop and Odell. Next slide, please. We see the shared system reflected in Odell's subsequent letter to Winthrop the following spring, where he writes, quote, "I have received your letter and have made use of it according to your directions upon the child, which as we conceive has done her very much good, for which we have great cause to render praise to the Almighty, and do acknowledge ourselves deeply engaged unto yourself. Our humble request is that you would be pleased, seeing God has been pleased to make you an instrument of much use, an instrument of much good in these ends of the earth," unquote. Thus, in these letters, we see the uses of alchemy and medicine engendering respect during a tumultuous period in which science, medicine, religion, and politics were intimately connected, with the boundaries among all of them far more porous then than they are now, or perhaps not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. And now we will move to Jessica Suarez from Harvard Divinity School.
Megan. Oops, sorry. Can I have the first slide, please? I'm going to talk briefly about one of our church record books from the First Church in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Church record books are an essential resource in our congregational records collections, as they contain information on how the church was run, as well as information on the local population, often including meeting minutes, resolutions and bylaws, membership lists, and vital records such as births, deaths, marriages, and baptisms. They're regularly used by church historians, genealogists, and those researching ministers. The page here from 1792 lists not only the names and ages of those who have died, but also includes cause of death, a less common practice. At the top of the page, you can see the headings for date, name, disease, and age. Next slide, please. This page is filled completely with death by smallpox, either quote the natural way or by inoculation. Just to note, the DO listed throughout the page is an abbreviation for ditto, commonly used in the colonial era. These records provide a way for communities to track the spread of disease, and in the case of smallpox here, the ways in which it was contracted, at a time when local governments were not yet equipped to keep these records in any consistent manner. To add some context to this page, there was a large smallpox outbreak in the area, originating from a ship arriving from Ireland this same year. It's also useful to note that at this time, inoculation was a familiar enough practice that it was required for it to take place in designated inoculation hospitals. Keeping records of deaths was an important method in monitoring outbreaks of various diseases, and they serve as a similar resource to contemporary researchers in the field of public health. Next slide, please. Additionally, these records contain information about the local population. It's most likely that these records were kept by the church as a service to the larger community rather than as a strict record of only its church members. In fact, clergy at this time often stepped into the de facto role of record keeper. While they were automatically responsible for keeping track of religious rites such as baptisms and marriages, they often also fell into the role of recording information such as cause of death, highlighted on the previous slide, in the absence of consistent authorities to do so. In this detail of the page, we can see two instances of Black women, no names given, and Newport, a Black man, among those who died of smallpox. Though not shown on this page, there are also instances of Native peoples being described similarly in other church record books, with either minimal or no name provided. These stand in contrast to some of the other entries on the page, such as Hannah Cotton, Sally Seaver, or William Spear. However, it wasn't only Black and Indigenous populations who were described sparsely in these records. Next slide, please. It was also common practice for minors to not be listed with their full name. You can see here sons of Joshua Gore, an infant daughter of Mr. Worsley, entered into the record book where the arrows are pointing. Children were most often solely listed by either stating son or daughter and their family name. Of course, there are always exceptions that prove the rule, such as Edmund, son of E.G. Welds, at the top of the page. The Welds were a prominent colonial New England family. In fact, Thomas Weld was the first minister of this church from 1632 to 1641, so including the name of a Weld child may have seemed especially important to record at the time. The information church record books provide not only give insight into how congregations manage the work of running a parish, they also offer valuable documentation on their local practices and populations. Yet understanding the many ways in which individuals were described in records of this period also speaks of the challenges in identifying Black and Indigenous individuals more fully. However, even spare descriptions can yield useful information for those willing to dig into these records. And I'm happy to say that through the Colonial North America project, we were able to digitize 35 of our collections, either in full or in part, including nearly 40 church record books. These will allow researchers to compare and contrast the content and methodology of the various churches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And now we will move on to Timothy Mahoney.
Hello, thank you, Megan. I have chosen a page from a daybook from the Daniel Ray and Son account book collection. It's a collection of 7 small account books with dates from 1764 to 1802. This particular collection is representative of Baker Library's extensive holdings of colonial era business records that are included in the CNA project. Could we go to the first slide, please? Daniel Ray Jr., who lived from 1743 to 1803, was a house painter and decorator in Boston, active from the 1760s to the first decade of the 1800s. His son, Daniel Ray III, joined him in business as a partner sometime after the Revolution and continued the business after his father's death. This daybook, which is a form of a financial account book, is a day-by-day list of the jobs that the Rays undertook, the name of their client, and the amount charged. The Rays clients included citizens and merchants of Boston, its civic organizations and churches, and the town government. John Hancock is listed as a frequent client. Though described as a house painter, Daniel Ray Jr. was really a craftsman and artisan. Ray's daybook, which you see here, which is dated 1772 to 1800, documents first the routine painting jobs that Daniel Ray and Son undertook, such as painting building exteriors, fences and doors, painting and papering interior rooms and homes and businesses, painting carriages, coaches, and ships, and other jobs. But the daybook also records the more sophisticated and artisan services that Ray and Son provided, such as gilding picture frames, decorating furniture, varnishing musical instruments, and making signs for advertising purposes. I chose this particular page because it reflects the variety of the Ray's work. The entries record daily transactions recorded on this particular page from December 5th to December 31st, 1797. At the top of the page, Ray records that he painted 25 fire buckets for 13 members of the Amicable Fire Society of Boston at a cost of $25 in total. Each member of the firefighting group is listed by name, and Ray notes receiving their individual payments for the work completed. Another entry records that on December 8th, he charged John Codman $1.50 for painting and repairing new doors and weatherboards at the new shed. Could we go to the next slide, please? The entry that makes this page particularly interesting is near the bottom, recording an example of Daniel Ray Jr.'s shop sign making activities. This December 31st, 1797 entry records a $10 charge to Richard Heyman for painting a sign on both sides federal arms. Ray includes in the entry a small rough sketch of an advertising sign. At the center of the drawing is the arms of the new United States, including the symbolic eagle with its stars and stripes shield. A ribbon on either side of the eagle reads Federal Courthouse, followed underneath by Good Entertainment by Richard Heyman. So it appears that this was most likely intended as a tavern sign. I wish I could tell you more about the Federal Courthouse Tavern. Unfortunately, I have not been able to locate information about Richard Heyman or determine whether or not there actually was a tavern in Boston in that name in 1797, but certainly more research in other records and perhaps other repositories might prove instructive. I'll close by saying that the Daniel Ray and Son account books collection is typical of Baker Library's holdings of colonial era business records. These records include the records of farmers, merchants, and traders, and a variety of craftspeople like Daniel Ray and Son. And together they provide a detailed view of the daily workings of life and society in colonial North America, particularly in New England and in Boston specifically. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. And maybe somebody who has signed into this meeting has an answer to your question. Next up is Ross Mulcair.
Thanks, Megan. And Grace, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So what you're looking at here is a pocket globe from the 18th century that was owned by a man named Ebenezer Storer. The Storer family was a Boston-based family of merchants, primarily doing wholesale import and export of textiles. And Ebenezer, like his father, Ebenezer, was deeply involved in that family business. Later in life, Storer was actually the treasurer of Harvard College, taking over that role in 1777 from John Hancock, who was preoccupied, to say the least, in Philadelphia and Baltimore. Because of the Storer family's close relationship to Harvard, over the centuries, since the 18th century, Harvard Library has acquired lots of material documenting the work and life of the Storers. One of the items in the Harvard University archives is this pocket globe that you're seeing here. You can't really tell from this image how big this object is, but in reality, it's about the size of a baseball. And when you're holding it, though, it feels more like a wiffle ball because it's quite light due to it being hollow. And as you can see, it's a terrestrial globe depicting the lands and seas of our planet, but also a celestial globe with the representations of constellations pasted on the inside of the case. Next slide, please. I want to shift our perspective a bit here and flip the globe upside down and take a closer look at it. Specifically, I want us to notice the dotted line that you can see running across the surface in the middle of this photo, as well as the text that's been added underneath it. So you can look at the left side of the image here between the green cartouche at the bottom and the upside down word "the" above that. It's not super easy to see here, but I can tell you that the words written right side up from this perspective are "Anson's going out." This label, as well as the dotted line you can see running through the Pacific Ocean on the left all the way to China on the right, is a reference to Commodore George Anson's journey around the world from 1740 to 1744. Anson was sailing on behalf of Great Britain, who was at the time at war with Spain. This is the War of Jenkins' Ear. And his goal was to sail to the Pacific and disrupt, to whatever extent possible, the machinations of the Spanish Empire there. In the interest of time, I'll leave the story at that, but Anson's circumnavigation story is really quite interesting if you want to read up on it later. This notation about Anson's journey, though, tells us a few things about this object. First, it gives us some practical information that we can use to date the globe. There's no publication or creation date on the globe itself, but we know that Anson's own account of his voyage wasn't published until 1748, and you don't really see it appearing on maps until that point. There was a market for these European-made pocket globes as early as the mid-17th century, so a century before this. So it's helpful to know that this is a relatively late example of this type of object. Less practically, but perhaps more importantly, Anson's route tells us something about the purpose of this pocket globe as well. Ebenezer Storer was the owner of this globe, but the creator of the globe was a man named James Ferguson, who was a fairly prominent Scottish astronomer. Ferguson bought the copper plates he used to produce this globe from an earlier English cartographer named John Senex, who was the official geographer to Queen Anne. Both Senex and Ferguson were deeply interested in geography and mapping and understanding the world, but both of them also consistently framed their work within the context of the bigger British imperial project that was growing in the 18th century. So I think it's interesting to stop and think about what exactly is depicted on this pocket globe, which because of its size can only fit so much information on it. Whatever is included on such limited space must be really important to whoever is creating these objects and compelling to those who are buying them. In this case, it isn't an accident that Anson's journey has such a prominent place on the face of the globe. This is Ferguson's celebration of his British peers' triumph over the entire planet. Not only did Ferguson and his fellow Britons depict the entire world, they can demonstrate here that they've essentially seen it all firsthand and effectively conquered it, at least metaphorically, and in some cases quite literally. They're making a kind of visual argument here for the superiority of the British Empire. In the final slide, I want to drive this point home even more. What you're seeing here is a close-up of a point that Ferguson has put in the middle of the ocean, just between the Antarctic Circle and New Zealand. It's hard to read, but what it says surrounding that point, starting at the bottom left and working clockwise, is London's Antipodes. So this is the antipodal point for the city of London. This is the point that is on the opposite side of the world from the city. And I like this detail because I think it really sums up what statement Ferguson and the people who would buy these globes, like Ebenezer Storer, are making. These are objects that represent the entire world, including landforms and peoples who were previously unknown to Europeans, but there's always a tension between this global knowledge and an overwhelming sense of Eurocentricity. This is ostensibly a globe depicting the world, but on closer inspection, you realize it's depicting the world as seen from what Ferguson and others considered the capital of the world, London. You see this tension in all kinds of documents from this period that are in the Colonial North America project, but I like that this one makes it so visually apparent. And I'll add as a final point that this way of thinking and organizing the world was incredibly powerful. You'll often still hear about Australia and New Zealand collectively referred to as the Antipodes or described as Antipodean, which continues to frame them in this colonial context. So this way of thinking has a really long legacy, and in some ways we're still stuck in this way of looking at the world, all of which I think is encompassed in this object. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ross. So now we're going to move to some questions that have come in for the presenters from participants. I'm going to start with one. There are several questions that are sort of similar, but the first is there's a similarity among the items you all chose to highlight this afternoon. These do not really represent the most recognizable people of the time, but instead the works and lives of lesser known, unknown, or even enslaved people. What kind of research into Harvard's collections do you think lies untapped or could support even deeper research? Anybody?
Well, I'm happy to start. I think the collections in the Harvard Law School Library are very, very rich, very broad, and very deep. You can get a lot of evidence out of there to show how law was studied, learned, and practiced on the ground, how everyday people's lives were affected by the law, and how those people in turn shaped the law in the early days of the colonies. I mean, there was all this, formal body of law that was received from England, the treatises, the case reporters, the books that came over. But then immediately there was the way it was actually applied in the colonies and how it was shaped to local circumstances. And I think there's a lot we know and a lot we don't know. And I think that a lot of the documents in the Colonial North America collection, each one is one small piece of evidence that you could look at individually and pull together to craft a larger narrative about how law evolved in colonial North America. And I think if I could just say one more thing about it, a lot of the material in our CNA collection, we see the law through the lens of personal stories. So it's not abject, copies, or not abject, not objective copies of statutes. It's, personal stories of people's lives. And because people tend to interact with the law and the legal system during moments of change and crisis, this might be the only evidence you would get, you would have about these people who otherwise might be completely unknown to us.
Thank you, Karen. Anyone else like to comment on that? Scott, I think your hand went up. Yeah.
Sure. In sort of what Karen had said, and it's amazing how these collections all speak to one another, and how the boundaries among them were all so fuzzy. But similarly, while John Winthrop is well known, his patients weren't always so well known, and patient voices are relatively seldom captured in historical collections. And this form of medicine at a distance that we saw in those letters in some ways links 17th century inquiries to emails that clinicians get today from their patients. It really exposes the evolving dynamics between patients and clinicians. And they point us to other collections across the university, really, that contain such patient records, really across these 350 plus years, whether from the collections at the Cantway to, for instance, the Richard Canner collections at the University Archives, which Chris Canner mined so well to examine turn of the 20th century patient doctor negotiations. So these less captured voices are really becoming evident here, and it's amazing. We're so grateful that they've been digitized, that scholars can access them.
Thank you, Scott. John.
Yeah, something I wanted to mention was what I think is really exciting about Colonial North America as a project is the scope of it. Because the traditional way to do a digitization project on a particular theme would be to sort of select highlights and really emphasize big names. And there's Washington letters and Jefferson letters and stuff like that in this collection. But taking the approach of really doing everything that sort of fits the window of this collection, I think was a really sort of radical and democratizing idea to bring out lots of things in the collection that would otherwise not be as well studied or selected for a project that was just focusing on highlights. So I think it's given researchers a really great opportunity to dig into more day-to-day kind of stuff because the vision for the project was so big.
John, anyone else like to jump in on that?
One thing I was thinking of when looking at the Dan Array records and the names of the clients included, it made me think of sort of the interconnectedness of all of the records, not just here at HBS and the business records, but potentially across all of the repositories of Harvard, so that, Daniel Ray is painting for John Hancocks of the world and for lesser known people as well, but it's quite possible, and Boston being a small place in the late 1700s, many of the same people are involved in all aspects of civic life, society in Boston at that time frame. So I think studying across the various repositories is something that the CNA project makes much more feasible and practical, so that hopefully those connections can be more easily found than perhaps they have been in the past.
Thank you.
I would like to add to what John and Tim just suggested, which is part of the question was about the untapped potential for these, or sort of deeper research that could happen because of this project. And I'll reiterate, I suppose, that the scope of this really does open up new ways of thinking about this period and the people that lived in it. And I want to call back to a project that John sort of mentioned offhand, which is the Peoples of the Historical Slave Trade Project, which is enslaved.org, of which Harvard is a participant. That type of tracking people, in this case, across collections and across repositories is really fascinating. And I think sort of the future of where this work is going, which does that. It connects these repositories in the way that Tim just described as well. And I think, you know, that project has to do with enslavers and the enslaved, tracking that specifically. But I think these colonial North America collections at Harvard is sort of a starting point for doing that type of tracing networks between people and their movements across the world for all kinds of people at the period. Because if you do research in this collection and sort of search around and look around, you realize you see the same names that cut across. You'll see something at the Harvard University Archives. You'll see them at the Baker Business School records. You can trace these people. John Hancock is one you've heard mentioned by 2 or 3 of us. Being able to make that kind of searching available for all of the people in here, I think is where this is headed and is really exciting about what might get revealed about early America.
Thank you, Ross. Anyone else want to make a little final comment or no on that one question? Jessica.
I can say just a quick thought that I think the scope, like John said, of this digitization project, I think gives a lot of opportunity for partnerships between researchers and librarians in terms of, you know, because of the large body of material that is now available to researchers, we're learning from them just as much as they're learning from these records about our own collections. So I think continuing those conversations with our researchers is a really important part of this project. And it allows us to further describe our collections even better over time. So.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions. It says, my interests include the lives of women, history of the Boston area, and the settling of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. What do we have?
So I was really excited to see this collection because we have something so great at Houghton that is perfect for it. And I want to encourage everybody to go take a look at it. It's a notebook put together by a woman named Phoebe Folger Coleman. And if you're searching in CNA for her, note that Phoebe has no E in it, it's just P-H-E-B-E, Phoebe Folger Coleman. And it's in the form that we call a commonplace book. Basically, she's copied some passages of text and some poems, and also some illustrations, some from other sources, but some that depict her life in the late 18th and early 19th century on Nantucket. So it's really an exquisitely beautiful book. It's part of our printing and graphic arts collection. Because her handwriting is so exquisite and the illustrations are really lovely. But it's also a really rich source for information about the life of a woman on Nantucket in that time period.
Thanks, John. Does anyone else want to jump in on any of those broad topics? Okay, I'm gonna move on to another question. Says most mercantile items discussed would be interesting to hear more about. I have an interest in heraldry and also in tavern and ordinary culture. Since it's so near to Passover, in particular, any items related to the Jewish community in Rhode Island would be interesting. Any comments on that?
From the business record perspective, I can talk a little bit about the CNA holdings or colonial era holdings that we have here. Merchant records are a big part of the colonial records that we do hold, and John Hancock is the best and biggest, the Hancock family papers, that is, including his uncle and predecessor, Thomas Hancock. But we have a number of other mercantile collections as well. So, and they often include correspondence and so forth. Records of interactions with London for Hancock per se. But in terms of, let's see, the question about Newport and so forth, or the Rhode Island, we don't have, our records are probably more focused on Massachusetts, but we do have records that cover the entire New England area. And but I would think that to answer the questions about specifically about Rhode Island, to check with Rhode Island repositories and so forth. But there quite likely are records of Jewish merchants and so forth in the Boston colonial era as well. Some digging would need to be done, I think, and further searching would be needed to find that. So not a quick and easy way to direct to a particular collection, but something definitely worth investigating further.
Thank you, Tim. And I have a question for Karen Beck. It says, how typical was the testimony you described? Was this the type of person who was accused of witchcraft? And were these types of suspicious events typical?
Okay, this is, I appreciate the question. I'm grateful to my colleague, Christopher Spraker. He and I had conversations about this. And yeah, it's interesting. The accusations were actually quite typical. Illness, disease, problems with livestock, various unexplained tragedies, strange noises, visions, nightmares, people seeing or dreaming that they saw witches with familiars. So what the townspeople testified to see was quite typical. But what was really interesting and very intriguing to me is that Mary Bliss Parsons was not the typical person to be accused of witchcraft. She was fairly young or middle-aged, I'm not sure. She was married, had a number of children, was financially well off. Their family was one of the pillars of the community. And most people accused of witchcraft were mostly women. They tended to be elderly, impoverished widows, people who had less of a voice and were less able to defend themselves. So it was kind of interesting that that Mary Bliss Parsons was accused of this a couple different times throughout her life, and particularly because it sounds like, as compared to Mary, Sarah Bridgman, the woman who slandered her, was relatively, of lesser means, had fewer children. Some of her children had died, so she was a somewhat lower status, and so it was kind of interesting. Mary was not the typical person accused, and I wonder what would have happened at the outcome of this if the two parties had been reversed.
Thanks, Karen. There's a few questions in here that I think I could answer quickly that have to do with the time period covered by this project. And I just wanted to point out that, as John mentioned earlier, we very deliberately have not highly curated this group of materials, but we decided to just identify where these materials were across the whole library system, and from beginning to end, digitize all of them. In doing that, that does mean that we would encounter collections that papers of an individual whose life may have crossed from the 18th century into the 19th century. And rather than stopping at the end of the 18th century, where we could, we continued well into the 19th century to capture the entire collection. We had to make some tough decisions based upon whether or not that also went into the 20th century, but by and large, we really did not try to cut off anyone's life at the end of the 18th century just to keep it within those bounds. That's true for the other direction too. If we did find materials that predated the 17th century, we did try to include some of those. There wasn't a lot, but we did try to incorporate a little bit of that into the project as well. I'm going to go to a question that I think would be going to Jessica.
Megan, before we go to Jessica, I'm
Yes,
sorry,
sure,
can
go
I just
ahead, Ross. Yep,
can I add one bit to what you just said, which is
sure.
the question of sort of periodization and even the geographic scope of this is also, it's not just one of practical concern of, it falls within the 17th and 18th century. Questions
Sure.
about what is North America and where is North America are worth asking, and were asked at all points during this. And the same question is, what is the colonial period? When does that begin and when does that end? I'm not going to give us an answer to that right now, but it is something that sort of a question that runs through all of this. And you could make arguments that in fact trying to stop at 1800 makes no sense from that standpoint, but in some ways it might make sense to stop at 1776 or 1812 or 1815. So I just wanted to add that there's also sort of intellectual concerns about the bounds of this as well.
Right, good point. Thank you. Okay, question for Jessica. I can find it again. What's the chronological range of the church record books that are digitized? What's the earliest and what is the latest? Do you know?
That's a little hard to say. I can say for this collection, the earliest are 1630. And I believe they go to about the mid-19th century, the record books. The collection has other material in it that goes until the mid-20th century. But it would vary according to the church and the collection. So I'd really have to probably search each one individually. But this one, the earliest records are 1630 in the record books.
Thank you. This is a question that several of you might be able to address from different perspectives. Are there capabilities on the site to enter transcriptions of documents to help others with reading them?
So I can start answering that one. As Megan suggests, there might be multiple ways of getting at that question, but on the Colonial North America site, the short answer is no, you can't search by sort of what's in the documents. You're searching the metadata and the descriptive, how librarians and archivists have described the objects, which was also one of the questions that came in. However, we have had over the past year, we've been building up a project, and I'm going to link it here for everybody, on From the Page, which is a transcription platform where we've pulled in about 50,000 pages from the 700,000 here to begin crowdsourcing the transcription of these. So from within those collections, you can search for keywords that are in the documents themselves, as well as contribute to the project by adding your own transcriptions and really closely reading these documents. And I'll say that I see in the attendees list several of the people who have been participating in this. So thank you to you all, because you're making possible this sort of elevated level of access here too.
Yeah, and I will add my thanks to Ross's. Transcription's incredibly powerful for unlocking a lot of the material in these documents that might not get, the very high level kind of description that, catalogers apply to, a thing that can be many, many pages long and cover lots of ground. And so by having access to search the full text of those documents, it really provides fertile ground for historians or people with a particular interest to be able to delve into those more deeply without having to sort of read everyone to find out what they contain. So I'm really excited about this project and the value that it's adding to these collections.
Karen.
I just like to echo that. I think that this transcription project that that is underway now is very exciting, and I'm grateful, like Ross, to everybody who's participated in creating transcriptions. Another piece of that is translations. We have a fantastic collection of colonial Mexican legal documents. And they're very exciting. And I'm really waiting for researchers to dig into these materials and tell us more about them. So some of the material in CNA also awaits translations. So putting a call out there for anybody who wants to try their hand, not only at transcribing, but translating your fellow scholars. All of us would be very grateful.
Yes, and I would add that just to what Karen's point is that sort of pushback against the Anglocentricity of early American scholarship is really important. And even if you can't yourself read French from that period or Spanish or something else, if someone can contribute that translation, it can really open up the world so that you're not recreating like the pocket globe view of the world, which is all based around London and English speakers.
Great, thank you. Another question here that any number of you could jump in on, I believe, says, I would be interested in hearing people talk about metadata and how it is that researchers might know which collections contain mentions of enslaved or free Black people.
I guess one thing I would say about that is at a very high level of generalization, it's often the case that works that relate specifically to slavery get subject headings that reflect that fact. I think it's probably less often the case that works relating to free people of color get those kind of subject heading. At Houghton, and I think this is true for the other libraries represented here, we're re-examining our practices for describing documents, thinking about how we can do more work to bring out those kind of connections in our cataloging for the work. And, as I mentioned, transcription, gives us the opportunity to delve into those things as well. So I would say it's not always easy, but there is material in there, and there's work ongoing to make it more visible.
I'll second what John says. We're, in the process of re-examining our collections, not just for the colonial era, but later and as well, to sort of make sure that we're being consistent in the terms that are used to describe enslaved people and others of that type, and that we're applying them consistently as well. So hopefully, as time progresses, it will be, we'll identify more resources that are useful to document that subject, and we'll make them that much easier to find as well.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a more general question that is, what was the biggest obstacle for you and your libraries and archives in selecting, digitizing, and making these documents available? I'll jump in on this and say that the biggest challenge, we'll be talking about this in a few weeks at another event, but one of the biggest challenges is the fact that these materials have accumulated over about 400 years. And over that 400-year period, you can imagine the number of people that tried to describe these materials in different eras and different cataloging eras, which is a challenge in maintaining that over time, but also just simply finding them and the language that's used and whether or not records have been updated over time was a very big challenge in just simply locating them. I wanted to just remind everyone too that this is a project that covers 15 different libraries at Harvard. So the simple fact of moving things around, moving them into preservation moving them into imaging was a transportation problem for us to, a challenge, I would say, for us to resolve throughout as well. So this took a lot of coordination, I would say, to actually do this work. But from the perspective of those of you in the libraries themselves, I'm wondering if there are any issues that you found challenging about a project like this.
If I can jump in, I'll say that I was impressed throughout with how the folks who work in conservation for Harvard Library did spectacular, miraculous work to take things that had been tightly folded up for centuries and unfold them so that they could be seen and photographed, to make things that were falling to bits safe and secure so that they could be handled for the photography process. You know, we had so many collections that needed that kind of help in order to be photographed without doing more damage. And that work has the added benefit of meaning that they're now better suited to survive another few centuries and hopefully more. And so I'm really grateful for the work that the conservation folks did on this project.
I think it didn't work, you're not going to say it. So anyway, Jessica, how about you?
Yeah, I would like to echo the work of the conservationists as well, and the coordination that they were able to put together with imaging services. I mean, it was really, it felt seamless a lot of the time from a repository perspective, because I know that there had to be so much negotiation over what was really in good enough shape to go through the imaging process. And oftentimes that wasn't something that, you know, they rarely decided that kind of on one end. It was always in consultation with each other and with the repository. And I found it a very eye-opening experience as well from our perspective to learn so much about that process. So I found that invaluable.
Mm-hmm. Karen.
I'll just add, I realized the question was about challenges, and we're all talking about all the things that went so well. But one of the things that I was really grateful for was that we picked a time period, again, with all the nuances that both Megan and Ross have alluded to. We basically picked a time period. We said everything within that time period is in. We did not try to do a subject matter breakdown, which I think would have added so many layers of complexity and delay, trying to figure out what's education, what's, you know, what has to do with, you know, women's study and so on. It just would have made it very administratively and really complicated. And I think having a clean, dividing it by time period enabled us to proceed more comprehensively and efficiently. I appreciated that.
Okay, I have another question here. It says, are there many inventories from the West Indies like the one John showed? Time-wise, my assumption would be that they show English people profiting from the use of slave labor long after British abolition. That might be too specific for anyone to answer, but any ideas?
I will mention that I know of at least one more in the collection that's in the form of a very large manuscript legal document on parchment that is again an inventory of that kind. There aren't too many, but it's definitely something that I am on the lookout for as a curator when I have the opportunity to add to the collection, because I think they're such important documentary evidence. Would be eager to bring more into the collection if I can.
So if you know of any out there, let us know. Let John know. There's a question that came here in which says, are there still or under processed materials at Harvard that will potentially be included one day in this project. I would say you probably could all answer the question more specifically, but we're aware that people continue to acquire materials from this time period, and our goal is over time to make sure that we can determine a way for those materials to be handled similarly, digitized and added to the core group of material that make up the website. But is anybody aware of anything particularly large or significant that is not included? So fairly complete. I should say here that the website that we have created for the CNA is not the only way that people can get access to this material. You can certainly find links, even if you're unaware that this project has been completed, you will see these materials linked to finding aids that are up online. You will find references and links in catalog records in the Harvard catalog as well. So there's multiple access points that will get you to this material that is online. Another question, and I think this might be the last one that we have time for. If you can just bear with me. Is there anything on your wish list from a website functionality perspective that would make these more accessible? I guess the question is, what more would you like for your libraries to make these materials even more known?
I can start with that one. And on my wish list, and you may be noticing a pattern based on the object I picked, and this suggestion is I would love to see these items. The transcription is extremely helpful to be able to get at these and make them more accessible, but also sort of visual ways to browse through these. So I would love to see the items geo-referenced or geocoded in some way so that you can look by location, and not just location that appears in a subject heading, but by specific pinpoints that people have added to a document. So if it mentions Newport, Rhode Island, I can see all the documents around Newport, Rhode Island, or Boston, or whatever. I think that would be a really incredible way to see how these documents cut across collections that have to do with space and people's sort of place in the world.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have a wish?
Well, it's not exactly a wish because it's already in the process of, it's always in the process of happening, but because the documents in CNA, like other Harvard Library digital projects, are viewable through the Mirador viewer, that's a broadly based project in the library community that is constantly undergoing enhancement and updates. So as that viewer gets more capabilities, that'll sort of automatically bring greater usability to CNA and to the other digital projects that Harvard does.
Anyone else want to add anything? This is your moment. Nope. All right. Okay, so, well, we're at the end of our program, and I want to thank all of our speakers today, including Scott, who had to step out a little early. In the coming week, we'll be sending a message to participants in today's presentation, and that will include links to the items described. This message will also provide a link to register for the next event in our series, which is a final multi-day symposium with the focus on the worlds that are opened up by digitization projects like this one. Panelists from the United States, Canada, and Italy will be discussing current thinking on how research and teaching are affected by the availability of digitized manuscripts, and also how machine learning and artificial intelligence might change the way we work with digitized manuscripts in the near future. The keynote talk, Digital Access and Making Early America Vast, will be delivered by Karen Wolf, who's a renowned early American scholar, director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture at William and Mary, and is a participant in the Georgian Papers program in the United Kingdom. This symposium will take place on April 6th, 7th, and 8th from 11 to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on each of those days. We'll also send a link to our presentation from last week, which focused on a 3D walkthrough of part of Widener Library with an exploration of an exhibition that highlighted items from across Harvard libraries that were included in this project, which found new life in this particular digital realm. And I just wanted to make note that we are keeping track of the questions that came in during this meeting and prior to this meeting that we weren't able to get to, and where we can, we will be referring those questions off to libraries that might be able to help answer those questions. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks. Thanks very much to all of our speakers. Thank you.